Hey everyone, in this video, I'll show you how to rig the snow day character as well as create a simple idle animation. There's a link to the source file in the video description if you'd like to follow along. With that being said, let's hop into it. So here's the snow day character, and as you can see, the artwork is fairly simple. The character's made up of mostly rounded rectangles. There's some custom shapes in here to make up the details, and some paths that are just strokes to make up like the arms and some of the other detail shapes here. Now for the animation, what we're going to be creating, we are going to have this bit of the scarf wave in the wind. So as we're rigging, we're going to need to keep that in mind. And we'll get a little bit of body motion. We're not going to have the arms do anything special, so we don't really need to add any extra bones for that. And the legs won't be lifting up off the ground, but we will need to add some bones to keep the feet and bottom of the legs attached to the ground. So again, as we're rigging, we'll keep these things in mind. Now, if you look at the hierarchy, you can see that I've got all of my shapes, aside from the shadow here, placed into groups. Now, the reason I've done that is, one, it just makes things a lot easier for organizational sake. And the other is that at some point, we're going to be adding our shapes to our different bones, creating parent-child relationships. And this will make things a whole lot easier. Now, I did that as I was designing the character in the editor. You can do that at the end after you finish the character, but I find that if you do it as you go along, it makes things a whole lot easier. So let's start by dropping in our basic skeleton. So just the bones that we're going to need for the body for right now. So I'm going to activate the bone tool with the B key. And holding shift, I'm going to start clicking to place the bones. Now, I'm ensuring that I'm putting the joints in these transition areas where I know that the artwork is going to deform. So like right here where the scarf sort of makes a bend, and that's also about where the head meets the body. And then the same thing here for the hip bone and chest bone. Its joint is right where the chest and belly meet. All right, so we've got our main bones in. Now we need to add in the secondary ones. So as I said before, we're going to be making this part of the scarf wave. So we're going to need some bones for that. So I'm going to activate the bone tool again and drop in a couple more bones. Now for when I'm making something wave, I usually like to use 3 bones because it gives you just a little bit more articulation than 2 bones do. Especially towards the end, you can really get some nice whipping action with the end if you have an extra bone there. Okay, so the scarf bones are set up. Now let's add in some bones to keep the feet and bottom of the legs attached to the ground. So I'm just going to activate the bone tool again. Drop in a couple bones. Technically, we could get away with a single bone, but I like adding both of these just in case in the future, if we do want to change up the artwork a little bit, change up the rig. We already have these in place, and it'll just make repurposing the rig a little bit easier. All right, so now that we have all of our bones, let's go ahead and rename them so that as we're animating or creating parent-child relationships or binding and weighting and doing all that stuff, we know exactly what bone is what. You wouldn't want to just guess which bone you're binding to or anything like that. So let me just quickly rename these. Okay, and then these are going to be left foot, right foot. Okay, so now all of our bones are renamed. We can go through and set up the parent-child relationships for the different chains. Now, when I rotate the head bone, I would like this bone chain to move along with it. So what I'm going to do is grab the root bone for this scarf chain and drop it right onto the head bone. So now that chain is a child of the head bone, and you can see when I rotate the head bone or move it left and right that this bone chain follows along. Okay, so when I move the hips of the character, like I said, I want the feet to stay planted on the ground and have the character sort of bend at the hips. So we can leave these bones where they are. We don't need to attach them or anything like that. And now that that's done, we can go ahead and start dragging and dropping our groups onto the bones. Now, the reason that we're doing this, there's two reasons actually. So the first reason is we don't want to go through the process of binding and weighting every single shape. And that's because it's a very time consuming process. And if you do it with too many shapes, you may see a little bit of a performance issue. So what we want to do is only have to bind and weight the shapes that are going to be influenced by multiple bones. So like all of the shapes in the hat and the head, these we're only going to use the head bone for them. So we'll just drag those and drop those onto the head bone. And we can put the scarf on the head bone as well to ensure that we have the proper draw order, just like that. We can put the body onto the hip bone. The legs can stay by themselves, and the background and shadow can stay by themselves. Now, when we start moving the bones around, you can see that the head looks fine, but this scarf isn't quite acting like we want. We can fix that. You can see that the shoulders here are not staying attached to this bit, which again we'll fix through binding and weighting. And nothing's happening with the top of the chest. Again, something that we'll fix with binding and weighting. And when we move the character, the hip bone left and right, you can see that the legs aren't doing anything right now. And that's another thing that we'll fix with binding and weighting. All right, let's start with the scarf. We'll start with this shape here. Now, all binding is telling this path which bones that we have on the stage can influence it or deform it. So right now we don't have any shapes bound. And to bind your bones, you're going to need to go to the path layer. So with the shape layer selected, I just hit enter, and now I've got the path layer selected. And you can see the bind bone options, or the bind bones option appears here in the inspector. And we'll click the plus button and select the bones and just continue to repeat that until we have all the bones that we want bound to it. So now all of these bones are available to weight the different vertices and handles. Now to see the vertices and handles, we're going to hit enter one more time and enter edit vertices mode. Now you can see we've got our vertices here and their handles. Now when you select a vertex or its handle, you can see what bone it's currently weighted to. And right now, every vertex and handle in this path is weighted to the scarf root bone. And the reason that is that was the first bone that we selected in the binding process. So if you remember as you're doing this, that all of your vertices and handles are going to weight to the first bone, you can sort of use it as a shortcut if you know that there's like the majority of your shape or path is going to be weighted to one bone. You just select that bone first. All right, so let's start at this end and start weighting these vertices and handles to the different bones. So I know that this bone is going to be the only one influencing these vertices and handles. So I'll go ahead and give the scarf 3 bone 100% influence over these. Now these handles are in more of a transitional area between the purple and red bone. So I'm going to give them, both of those bones, equal influence over these handles. And I'm going to do the same thing with these handles because they're in another transition area. But instead of using the purple and red one, I'll use the blue and purple one. Just like that. And now these handles and vertices I want to make sure are weighted to this, which they are. And now we can test it out and see how that looks. So I'm just going to rotate these bones to make sure we're getting a nice curve, and we are. But you can see when I rotate this root bone here that the edge of the artwork starts sticking out a little bit from behind here. And we don't want that to happen. So we can fix that fairly easily by binding another bone and using the head bone this time. And we'll use this head bone as an anchor for these vertices and handles. So I'm just going to change the weighting there and then double check that that fixed our problem. And it did. Okay. Now that we know what this path should be bound to and weighted to, we can do this path because it's the same path. I just duplicated it, changed the color, and moved it up to create this rim lighting. So I'm just going to go through and bind all the same bones and then weight them like we did before. So we'll put this on the end there. Transition area between the red and yellow, like that. Purple and red, like that. And then make sure that this is on the head, which it is. We'll double check. Make sure everything looks good. And it does. Okay, so now we have this rigged up. Let's move on and get this part of the scarf ready. So when we rotate the head bone, you can see that the top of the scarf, the base of the scarf, is actually acting correct, but this bottom portion here isn't. So we need to make sure that this portion stays attached to the chest and this portion stays attached to the head. So let's bind the chest and head bone here. All right. And then weight these up here to the head bone. And once again, we have our transitional handles and vertices, and we'll give those equal influence. And then make sure these are attached to the chest, which they are. And because this shape is the same as this one, I'm going to go ahead and bind and weight it the exact same way, just so we can test two paths out at once and make sure that everything's correct, and we're doing it just a little bit faster. Okay, so now that that's done, we'll test it out and make sure everything looks right, which it does. You can see if we push the rig too far, we get some weird deformations, but we'll keep that in mind as we're animating. All right, so now what we need to do is fix these shadows, and I'll do this one first because it's almost the same shape as this, so I'm fairly confident we can get away with the same weighting here. Nope, need these. Head and chest, which they are. Okay. And then let's do this shadow here. Now this whole shape kind of sits in a transition area, so what I'm going to do is go ahead and give this all of the vertices or vertices and handles shared, or these bones shared influence over all these vertices and handles. All right, let's test that out. And that looks pretty good. Just keep in mind that as you're going through and binding and weighting, that you throw in an initial weighting value and then you check it. And if it doesn't work, just go back and continue working until it continue changing the values until you're happy with the results. All right, let's move on to the body here. Start with the main body shape. And I know that I want the chest, this area to move with the chest bone and this area to stay with the hips. So we'll bind it to the hips and chest bone like so. And continue using the same values that we've been using because they've been working well so far. Okay, that's good. Test that out, make sure it's working. Yep, you can see that the shoulders now are sticking to this portion of the artwork, which is exactly what we want. All right, let's get these detail shapes on the center of the jacket figured out. You might not be able to see it with the bones in the way. So let's select this line here, and I'm going to enter path layer, show the bones, and then select my hips and my chest bone again. Okay, now I'm in edit vertices mode, hide the bones. Now you'll notice that I don't actually have an additional vertex here in the center to account for the deformation. So we'll fix that. We'll just activate the pen tool with the P key and drop in another vertex right there in the center. Now I want to change the handles because if I just leave it on the straight handles, if this deforms left or right, you can see we get a harsh, sharp angle, which I don't want. I'd like a nice curve. So I'll just change it to a mirrored handle, and that's going to look good when it's deformed. So this is already bound. Let's just go ahead and weight this. So the top one, I'm going to weight to the chest. These all give a shared influence because it's a transition area, and that's going to be on the hips. All right, let's re-show the bones and take a look. All right, this curve looks pretty nice. Now, you can see that the zipper part here is not moving. Now, we don't need to bind this or weight it. We can just grab the shape and drop it right onto the chest bone because remember, it only needs one bone to influence it, so we don't need to bind and weight it. And you can see that that made that work just fine. All right, so the next thing we need to do is get the arms onto our rig here. Now, again, we didn't add in arm bones, so we're going to continue using the hips and chest bone as the bones that are going to be influencing everything, and continue along with the same weighting that we have been. That's on the hips already. I'm going to go ahead and do this other shape as well. Let's make things move a little bit faster. Oops, that needs to be 100. Make this 50%. And that's on the hips already. Okay, let's test that out and make sure everything looks right. And it looks like everything is going to work fine there. You can see that this portion is staying attached to the pocket area, and this portion is staying attached to the shoulder, which is exactly what we want. Now let's do the detail shape here, and we'll use the exact same bones. Now this one's got a couple more vertices and handles, but that's okay. We're going to continue on with the same values. That's already attached to the hips, so that's good. Now let's double check it. And that looks just fine. Now, again, like up here, if we push the rig too far, you can see we get some strange deformations, but that's okay. Again, we'll keep that in mind as we animate. All right, let's do the other side really quickly, and it's the same shapes, same paths. So we'll just use the same values and bones that we did on the opposite side, because we know those work already. Okay. Needs to go on the chest, transition area, hips. Okay. Let's get the detail shape. Now, one thing you might notice is that if you try and select some of these shapes or paths on the stage, you can't quite click them, but if you hold Control, then it'll allow you to drill down through the shapes and actually select, or the groups, and select the shapes directly on the stage. All right, so let's do this detail really quickly here. Chest, transition, hips. Okay, that looks good. Let's double check that. Yeah, that looks pretty good, because we're not going to be moving this bone too much, so this little overlap problem here is not going to be an issue for us. All right, so we're almost there. The last thing we need to do is get the legs working with our hip bone here. You can see when we move the character by the hips, the actual hips of the character stay where they're at. So let's bind that. We'll bind it to the hip bone, and we'll use these feet anchors down here. Okay, so that's on the hips. Put this one on the left foot, this one on the right foot, just like that. Let's do the rim lighting shape there. Okay, and then we'll test it out and make sure everything is looking right. Hips, yep. Okay, that looks good. Let's get this detail really quickly. Same principle. And put this one on the right foot, just like that. All right, let's move the character's hips and make sure that everything looks right. Okay, so now we are nearly ready for animation. There's one last thing we want to do, and that is select everything on the stage and create another group and rename it root group. Now, what this group is going to allow us to do is we can now create animations. And if we ever need to change any of the transform properties of the entire composition, like scale, position, rotation, any of that, we can do that here in design mode. And the effects will take place in animate mode as well without having to set any new keys. So it won't mess up any of the keys that we had before. Now, if you animate and you don't have a root group and you need to go back and change those things, you'll have to change the keys in animate mode, which is a very long process. And so to avoid that, we just like to put everything on a root group before we animate. So with that being done, we are ready to jump into animate mode. So let's do it. So here we are in animate mode and we're ready to get this guy animated. So let's start with the scarf. So I'm just going to select the scarf bones and my playheads here at the beginning of the timeline. I'm going to position these in our first pose. So I'm going to use the rotation up here in the inspector and make it swing up. And then move the playhead to the middle of the timeline and make a new pose where all of the bones are going down. And then I know that this is going to loop, so that means that we need our first keys to be the same keys as our last one. So I'm just going to copy and paste these to the back of the timeline. And now I'm going to enable loop and we'll take a look and see how that looks. Okay, so the motion looks okay. We can improve it in a couple of ways. The first thing that I notice is that the wave is not happening fast enough. So I'm going to make this loop twice on the timeline. Right now it's just looping once. So I'll reposition the keys so that we can get two of these loops in. So I've just moved them and split the difference here. So now our loop only takes 30 frames or 30 seconds. I'll copy that and paste it here. And so now our loop is happening twice within a second. So the speed now looks better, but the motion isn't great. Let's add some easing. So I'm going to select all the keys and change my easing from linear to cubic. So it's going to give it an ease in and then ease out. So it's not going to be just interpolating at the same rate the entire time. And you can see that that's already made the motion look better. Now we can make it look even better by offsetting these keys so that all of the bones don't hit their next pose at the same time. We want them to hit this next pose individually at different times. So the way we're going to do that is first we need to give ourselves some extra time on the timeline. So I'm just going to go to the duration, type in 200. So that gives us 2 seconds. So we've added an additional second. I'll zoom the timeline out just by using this little scrubber here. And then we're going to enable work area. Make sure we set it up to be a second long, which it is. So from here to here, that's a second. And we'll reposition all of our keys to make sure that they fit into that space, which they do. Okay, so what we want to do is offset our keys. So we want to offset the second and third from the first one, and then the third from the second one, like that. And you'll get these nice lines here. For a waving animation, I'm always looking for this typically. Now, when we preview the animation, you'll see that the motion already looks better, but that there's a little bit of a hitch when the animation jumps back to the front. Now, the reason that is we have keys extending past the timeline or past the work area here, but we don't have any keys over here in front to get the correct interpolation from here to here. You can see that when we jump from the start of the work area to the end, we get a little bit of jump there. Now, the way we have to think about this is these keys are rotating from here to here, and it's taking 15 milliseconds basically. So what we need is, and these keys are the same as these keys. So what we need are these keys to be positioned 15 seconds before these, so that the interpolation from here to here is the same as the interpolation from here to here. Now, the easiest way to do this is if you have something simple like this, where it's just a 3-key loop like this. Remember that these are the same as these, and these are the same as these. So what we can do is just copy these last 2 sets of keys, paste them at the start of the timeline. Select those keys that we pasted and then overlap these two sets of keys, which are the same ones, and we have our timing set. Now we can go in, offset the keys forward like so, and you'll see that the loop no longer hitches because we have the same timing from here to here as we do from here to here. Okay, so the wave in the scarf looks good. Now we want to give our character a little bit of movement. So we're going to use the exact same motion, slightly different. We'll start with these two keys here. Pose the character swaying to the left. Pose the character swaying to the right. And then copy and paste the first keys to the end there. All right, we'll throw some easing on it, cubic. And now let's rotate our head bone here. So instead of going the same direction like we do with this, let's go ahead and rotate it in the opposite direction. Just make the motion a little more interesting. Copy and paste that first key to the end. Apply the same easing. And then we can test it. Okay, so now that looks pretty good. Let's once again offset these keys so that all of our bones are not rotating and arriving at the next pose at the same time. So again, I'm going to copy and paste these two keys to the beginning of the timeline. And because these are spaced 30 milliseconds apart, we didn't actually need to reposition the keys to line them up. And now we can just offset our chest and head. So, and give it a preview, and everything is working properly. So that's our idle animation. Before I end the video, I'd like to pose a challenge. See if you can recreate this animation using our character. Now, you may have to add some extra artwork and bones, but I think you've learned enough in this video to make it happen. If you do participate in the challenge, post your creations on the community because we'd love to see what you're working on. And even if you just followed along with the video, still post it up there. We'd like to see it. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything like that, or if there's something in particular you'd like to learn, drop a comment in the video and we'll try and address those as quickly as possible. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in the next one.